What do I mean by it changed over time without changing? Well, I'm not referring to the game itself not changing, but people changing their minds and their opinions on the game. So how is this? If nothing physically changed with the game, then why would people come to like Borderlands the pre-sequel now, 11 years after its release? Well, that's what I'm going to be discussing in this video, as well as things I think the game did well, and some things I think it did wrong. I'll break the video up into different segments, so if you wanted to skip forward, feel free, and I'd love to hear what your opinion on Borderlands the pre-sequel is in the comments. But yeah, let's get started. Why was it hated at launch? There are numerous reasons why this game wasn't perceived well at launch, but the one that stands out to me the most is that people were expecting Borderlands the pre-sequel to be Borderlands 3. At the time, the latest game was Borderlands 2, which already set a high bar for the franchise, but people were expecting the game to be the new Borderlands in the franchise, which it was of course, but it felt the same as Borderlands 2, but worse. If you were to do a survey and ask 100 Borderlands players which they prefer, Borderlands 2 or Borderlands the pre-sequel, 99.99% of the time, Borderlands 2 will win, and rightfully so, as it is the better game all around, in my opinion. But this doesn't mean the game is bad by any means. My point here is that expectations were high, too high, so high not even Robert Wadlow could reach it. And because of this, as well as the game being arguably a bit worse than the previous game in the franchise, people were upset, and it led to Borderlands the pre-sequel being perceived as a bad game for the longest time. This is understandable though, as Gearbox and 2K Australia were tasked with making something more perfect than perfection itself. To make it clear, I love the game and I think it's very well made, but we'll get into that soon, I promise. Just the overall quality of Borderlands pre-sequel felt worse than its predecessor. There wasn't as much content compared to Borderlands 2, and because of this, people didn't really like the game at first. Why did people eventually like it? So over time, Borderlands pre-sequel was just resting there, marinating if you will, until one day, Borderlands 3 came out, and yeah. I personally think this was a big reason Borderlands pre-sequel got a lot of attention, because Borderlands 3 was also perceived as a bad game at launch by a lot of the community. People were still thirsty for that new refreshing Borderlands feel, and due to Borderlands pre-sequel being so neglected when it initially launched, people began to realize it wasn't so bad, more like a slightly worse version of Borderlands 2, but it had all of the features that have grown to be critical when making a successful Borderlands game. Unique weapon rarities, rarer drop rates, cool characters, an interesting story, and so on. In my opinion, Borderlands pre-sequel does all of these things a lot better than Borderlands 3, so for that reason, the game gained a lot more attention. It wasn't like a massive player spike by any means, but over time, as a community, people began to realize how underrated this game was. A great example of this would be if Borderlands 4 flops, then people who hated Borderlands 3 will likely go back to it and say that it wasn't that bad, as they would be so disappointed in what Borderlands 4 was. You see this often with other franchises too, with things like the COD cycle. A new COD will come out and people will hate on it, and all of a sudden the old ones that used to be hated aren't as bad. But moving away from why people did or didn't like the game, now I'm going to talk about some things that the game did right and wrong in my opinion, starting with the story. You either love it or hate it, and personally, I love it. My first playthrough was way back when, and I never completed it, because I thought it was just boring. But if you care for the lore of the game, you'll love the story. It shows a lot more depth to the characters, and how they came to be where they were in Borderlands 2, everyone before the Destroyer was released in Borderlands 2. It's great for filling in the gaps and explaining critical things, like why Jack wears a mask of his face on his face. My only complaint is that for a full release, the game is quite short. Online it says it takes 27 hours, which is only 3 hours shorter than Borderlands 2 apparently, but I don't think that's accurate. If it's your second playthrough and you know what you're doing, you'll fly through it. But to be honest, I don't think that's a make or break factor, as there's still a lot to do in the game. Guns. I recently mentioned this, but compared to the latest release, Borderlands 3, the rarity for drops is done a lot better. I'm not going to pretend like I know the ins and outs of it, but I've played enough to know that it's rewarding to a player when farming for a certain item. Not only that, but it has unique rarities, with the glitch weapons being some of my favorite in the whole game. You get them from the Claptrap DLC, and they're really unique and just fun. This is a feature Gearbox seems to have stopped in the latest releases, but hopefully we see some in Borderlands 4. One more thing about the guns that is unique to this game only is the laser weapons. They're actually really good, but we only really see them in this game. But I'm sure that's explained in the lore somewhere. I'm just not sure why. Like, for example, they may only be manufactured on Elpis. Characters. There's two things I want to talk about here primarily with the characters. The playable characters and the story characters. First off, the playable characters. Now, I haven't played as every single character. I've only played 4 out of the 6, but they're super fun. Borderlands Pre-Sequel has some of the most interesting and funny playstyles I've seen, and for that, I have to give it credit. My favorite characters to play are either Claptrap or Nisha, or is it Nina? I forget. I'm pretty sure it's Nisha, because Claptrap is just shit on throughout the whole game and it's quite funny. And Nisha is just, well, awesome. And also I get to flirt with Handsome Jack. But that's besides the point. Now, the characters in the story are really good as well. And I don't want to glaze Handsome Jack here, but seeing how he used to be, this nice, heroic person, and watching him slowly descend into evil in this villain arc-esque story is really interesting. Aside from Jack though, it's of course always amazing to see Moxxi. But in this game, there's a moment where she drops her Hey Sugar act, and you see her dressed as a mechanic. As if you didn't already know, she's the mother of Ellie and Scooter, the Catch-A-Ride owners. In this moment, it's really cool to briefly see a different side to Moxxi, and my only complaint is that we don't get to see it more. Lilith and Roland make an appearance too, and watching the subtle conflict turn into the reason the story on Borderlands 2 unfolded is really fun to see. At first, they are both teamed with Jack and slowly begin to realize what Jack is doing, and they decide to betray him. I personally think that it's done really well, and it doesn't feel out of place in the storyline whatsoever, but obviously people have different opinions on this. One more thing to mention here is that Elpis, the planet you're on, which is also Pandora's moon, feels like Australia. No, I mean it. A lot of the characters in the game have Australian accents, and I love it. It makes Elpis feel so much different to Pandora, which is a good thing. It gives it its own unique play on creating a Borderlands environment. Now, obviously, this is because it was made by 2K Australia, but I just think it works very well. And I'm really, really excited to see if we get to go back to Elpis in Borderlands 4. And that's it. That was my take on Borderlands the Pre-Sequel. This is a shorter video, so I do apologize, but I don't want to cover farming or other things that are common between Borderlands the Pre-Sequel and Borderlands 3 in this game, as I recently made a video on Borderlands 3 covering all of those things, and the only reason I covered those things is because Borderlands 3 doesn't do them correctly, whereas in Borderlands the Pre-Sequel, there's no reason to mention them because farming's fine and everything else is done just right. The next video should be on Borderlands 2, so I'm excited for that, but if not, I had another video in mind, but I'll keep my community page updated as much as I can. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.